Hey there, I'm Jackie Ferris. This week on the 302, we are at Winterthur checking out an ongoing exhibit called Bearing Witness that takes a deep dive into early African American culture. It's a prime example of there being more to the story than what meets the eye. Stay tuned, the 302 is going to lay it all out for you. Welcome to Winterthur, where we're going to be talking about an ongoing exhibit called Bearing Witness. I'm joined now by Alexandra Deutsch to tell us more about the significance of this exhibit and why you just keep, it's like a rolling exhibit. So first of all, what's the premise, Bearing Witness?
So the premise is that the objects that we're interpreting in the gallery and actually throughout the gallery space on the first floor of the gallery's building bear witness to interactions and histories that often have not been represented in earlier interpretations. And it really is the notion that the stories that are embedded in objects are the things that bear witness to human interactions, and many of those interactions go well beyond the borders of the histories we know them to already have.
Now, a lot of the pieces that you put out for people to consider when they come to visit have a connection to the African American culture, early African American culture. One particularly, the one that we're looking at here, connected to a very dark portion of history, the Colfax Massacre. Tell me, what are we looking at here?
This is known as the Liberty Monument by Anna Pottery. It was created in Illinois by two brothers, the Kilpatrick brothers. And this ceramic was acquired last summer, in fact, and we're coming up on just over a year anniversary of having it in the collection. What's so extraordinary about the ceramic in of itself is that it does depict this very dark day in American history that sadly so many people don't know about, which is the Colfax Massacre, which happens in Colfax, Louisiana in 1872 and is depicted here in what we call the Liberty Monument. And this is a tragic event where at least 150 free Black citizens, men, women, and children, but particularly men, were essentially slaughtered as a result of a gubernatorial election in Louisiana.
Now, when we talk about the reasons behind the massacre, was it connected? You said the gubernatorial election. Did they not want them to vote? Were they lining up to vote? I mean, how did this all play out?
The tragedy of this is that, in fact, the Black citizens, with the help actually of one of the wealthiest white men in that parish in Louisiana, because in Louisiana the different segments of the state are called parishes, actually helped them vote because there was such widespread voter suppression. This was for many of these Black citizens the first time that they had ever had an opportunity to vote. So they were able to vote. The whole lead up to the election was fraught with voter suppression. And then when in fact, the election resulted in a candidate being chosen who would have supported the rights of Black citizens. In fact, this was strongly protested, and the Black citizens were in the courthouse. They were then attacked by a group of white citizens who had been threatening them in the lead up to the election and actually assaulting them and doing various things to prevent them from voting. But eventually the Black citizens are trapped in the courthouse, and the white citizens begin to essentially set the courthouse on fire. As the Black citizens flee, they are chased and shot. Many of them are shot almost irreparably, so that they can barely be identified by their relatives, and it ensues a whole onslaught of violence in the hours that follow the attack on the courthouse.
It's really such a dark chapter in history, and for it to transcend from real life into a piece of art. I mean, it had to be very profound on the maker.
Absolutely. So to acknowledge these are white brothers, but they had what we would call today very liberal political views. They made utilitarian wares, so everyday wares, things like crockery, very familiar things to us, but then they would make these unique, monumental pieces that often were powerful political commentaries. And they would situate these large-scale works on their tables of wares when they were selling them at different pop-up fairs and other means that they were selling, and they would have these monumental statements of their political views, which at the time were risky, but the Kilpatricks were known for that, and they tackled some of the most difficult commentaries that we have today on Reconstruction era politics.
And when you look at it, I mean, you have to look really closely to really see what's happening, because otherwise it doesn't look like a massacre. Do you know what I'm saying?
It doesn't. I think that one of the reasons that we have it situated right at the center of Bearing Witness is it really encapsulates how we are hoping visitors will engage with the objects we're presenting in this ongoing initiative, which is you see it in almost a 360 view, because each side of the object really has a story to tell, but it also, each side tells a different perspective. So on one side you have the black figures, and if you look closely, many of them are covering their heads. You see a figure who's sort of scaling the side of the monument. And then if you look at the other side of the monument, you see white figures. And so there's so much complexity in this object. It's really also a commentary on the politics of the era, the general corruption of national politics during Reconstruction. And then on its surface, on a very utilitarian level, the vessels that are embedded throughout the object are actually match safes, where you would put your matches in those.
It's kind of ironic.
And it has a really powerful irony there because of the firing on the courthouse.
Now, this work, I don't know if it was almost lost, but people didn't know what they had.
Right.
So talk to me about the discovery process.
This was really an extraordinary event in the history of American ceramics. This had been acquired by basically a collector, but someone who was almost like a picker, didn't have a particular focus on American ceramics, came across this object and thought it was a sewer tile ceramic, which is a more common type of ceramic, and contacted Crocker Farm. Crocker Farm is an auction house that specializes in American ceramics, but particularly redwares and stonewares. And they had an expertise in the work of the Kilpatrick brothers. They actually contacted me about another object in advance of the sale, which was by David Drake, the black potter. But by good fortune, when they sent me the document about the David Drake piece, right below it was this. And the minute I saw it in my email, I had chills. I just was absolutely astonished to be looking at what I was seeing and to read the history. I knew the work of the Kilpatricks, and then realizing that Winterthur has a strong tradition of collecting the most important works of American craft. And I just knew this was something that would be really transformational for the collection.
It really is just a sight to see. I want to say it's gorgeous, but knowing what it represents, I feel a little weird about that. But there's so much more in Bearing Witness, and we're going to talk about that when we return.
This is Wesley Paulson from Clear Space Theater giving a shout out to the 302 and thanking you for supporting live theater at the beach.
Welcome back. We're at Winterthur talking about their ongoing exhibit, Bearing Witness. I'm joined by Alexandra Deutsch. Now, Alexandra, let's talk a little bit about this painting behind us. There's really an interesting story behind it and the artist who created it.
We were very fortunate to acquire this painting by Robert S. Duncanson, which is a depiction of the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. But what is really special is Duncanson's own history. He was a free black man working as an artist. This was done before the Civil War, more than 10 years before the Civil War. And he was traveling through the country at a time where he was at risk in doing so, but creating these remarkable views. And Duncanson is definitely one of the lesser known painters in 19th century American landscape, and yet as accomplished as some of the great names who we know today.
Absolutely. And when you think about the time in which he was doing this, there weren't a lot of schools for African Americans to go and learn how to paint. So is he self-taught, or?
He is to some extent self-taught, and one of the things that we have been working on since acquiring this in 2018 is to understand more about his history. His works are held at other institutions as well, and actually we were able to host a whole study day devoted to Duncanson, his history, his painting techniques, and really trying to understand more about how did he become so accomplished. He eventually goes to Europe, and so his level of exposure to really the art of the time in that period in the 19th century was significant, and clearly he had tremendous capability because he was a remarkable painter.
Absolutely. When you look at, just it almost looks like a photograph. If you look at it, the detail is so precise. The crane in the lake there, in the stream. It really kind of gives you a sense of place.
Absolutely. And what I particularly love about Duncanson's work, and we have been able to understand more because of our conservation labs at Winterthur, is we have been able to do that kind of microscopic analysis of the paintings. And one thing we have learned about Duncanson, which goes to a point that you just made, is that this seems almost photographic, and yet looked at closely, he used a real economy of brush strokes. So in another work we have of Duncanson, which is just a sketch, in just 5 brush strokes, he's creating a whole figure. So he was really a master with his brush.
Now, when you talk about this painting 10 years before the Civil War, how long does his career stretch?
His career goes another few decades into the 19th century.
Now, was his style always landscape? And is this oil, by the way?
Yes, it is, and predominantly landscapes. Yes.
Mm-hmm. I wonder what about the landscapes that spoke to him, and since his style didn't change, because a lot of times you see artists that'll start out, doing portraits, and they'll do landscapes, and they'll do something else. What about it that kind of had him focus on just that one medium?
This really is a period in American painting when the celebration of the beauty of the American landscape is being celebrated. Also, it's a time of industrialization, so you are seeing changes in the American landscape that are particularly significant, that are destroying its beauty. So you have artists like Cole and Church, and names that might be more familiar to others who know American painting. And you have Duncanson really fitting right into the landscape painters of the time. Mostly he is known as a landscape painter.
So when you think about the time, how was he able to travel so freely? I mean, was he a man of means?
He was not necessarily a man of means, but he was a free black. Mm-hmm. And so he is able to travel. And of course, there are definitely inherent risks of travel, but he is in New York, he's in Pennsylvania, he's going into Ohio. But as you get further into the southern part of the US, of course, he would have been taking more significant risks.
So since you acquired this painting, I would imagine that the research has really just stepped up to find out more about, his life and his work and his influences.
Yes, absolutely. So we were immediately galvanized by this acquisition to create a study day where we assembled scholars from all over the country who could talk about Duncanson's life, legacy, work. We have been working closely with our conservation lab, who has been working on analyzing Duncanson's work on a deeper, more scientific level. And then subsequently, we were able to acquire a rare oil sketch by Duncanson, which is a view of Scotland, and that has allowed us, or probably thought to be a view of Scotland, and that has allowed us to further understand him. So the one thing about Winterthur is that we never stop studying the objects that come into our collection, and we have so many resources here to do that.
And we certainly appreciate that. And we're going to talk more about bearing witness when we return.
I'm DJ Fazik with Coastal Cruises, and we love cruising with the 302.
Welcome back. We're talking about bearing witness at Winterthur. I'm joined again by Alexandra. Now, Alexandra, what are we looking at here? It looks like molding of some kind.
So these are actually the planes used to shape molding. And they're such humble objects, and I love that we have them in the Winterthur galleries. We have vast collections of tools, but these are particularly special because they have a really important story behind them, and they bear witness to a relationship that really hasn't been celebrated in our galleries before, and that is the relationship between Francis Nicholson and Caesar Chaleur. Caesar Chaleur worked for Francis Nicholson in his plane making shop in Massachusetts. Nicholson had the largest plane making shop, so tool making shop, actually in that whole area of the state. And what is so fascinating about these is that eventually Nicholson frees Chaleur, and then Chaleur takes over this business. So that in of itself is a story that we wanted to represent in the galleries. But what is even more special is that we have a plane that is actually stamped with Caesar Chaleur's mark. And unfortunately, very few Black artisans have left their personal marks on objects. So often we're uncovering their histories, but not necessarily seeing their marks on objects they created.
Now, you had mentioned that after working for him, that Chaleur was freed to take over, take over the business.
Yes.
That's not something that typically happened back then. So it was a rare instance of, a friendship, a bond that formed.
And we'll never quite know what entirely that history was, but obviously Nicholson recognized that Chaleur was a highly skilled artisan and had the capacity to take over such an important business.
So how did Winterthur come across, acquire this? I mean, I can imagine you probably have a lot of, people that come to you with objects, and you're constantly looking at things that need to be preserved. I mean, but this is unusual.
It is unusual. We are one of the important centers of teaching the history of American craft. And we have a very long tradition in the collection of acquiring tools that help us understand the history of American craft. Particularly, we have a remarkably strong collection of American woodworking tools. And that's something that really begins with Mr. DuPont. He felt very strongly that as a teaching institution and as a collection that was representing the whole expanse of American material culture, that we should also have the tools used to produce those objects. And so I think these planes really go to that lasting sensibility at Winterthur of actively acquiring not necessarily always the high style things that people associate with us, but very utilitarian, functional objects like this, because then we can tell the broadest possible stories.
Absolutely. And you wouldn't think to look at it that, these are pieces that have such rich history, but they do. And they do tell a story that has been, like I said, untold largely.
Yes. And I think for us, what I've found really exciting when Josh Lane, our curator of furniture, proposed these is the fact that when you just look at them and they haven't been installed in a gallery, you might not look twice at them. You might not pay attention to them, but really bearing witness, and this installation gave us an opportunity to really have visitors do exactly what you've been doing, is looking at them, thinking about the story, and thinking about the people embedded in these simple objects and how rich that history is. I also love that we're acknowledging that we don't know all that history and that we're still learning the histories, especially when it comes to Black artisans where the documentation is much more challenging.
It's absolutely powerful, the stories behind the items that you've shown us, and you have so many more, and this exhibit is a rolling exhibit, right?
Yes, it is, and we are evolving it. Usually once a year, we're changing out the objects in it. We have more objects that we could possibly put into the Bearing Witness installations than we could possibly do. But what we're really building towards is an exhibition in 2026 when we come to our nation's anniversary, where we are going to continue this bearing witness interpretation to really look critically at America's history through the full expanse of our collection.
Well, you got me excited with a special show in 2026, so hopefully we'll be back to check that out. And before then, of course, Alexandra, thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you so much, Jackie.
We'll be right back. For more information on Bearing Witness or any of the exhibits here at Winterthur, just visit winterthur.org. That'll do it for this week's episode of The 302. We're going to leave you now with some beauty shots of the Brandywine River. Until next time, I'm Jackie Ferris. Tell them you saw it on The 302.